As a symbol of America's resolve, my administration will work with Congress and these two leaders to show the world that we will rebuild New York City.
Please take a second to subscribe, then like and share afterwards. We can really use your support. Thank you.
That we will rebuild New York City.
In our previous episode, we uncovered the Jubilee of 2017 and the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and rightful possession. It would complete the return of Israel to the Promised Land, with everything set in place as it was prior to 70 AD. We must announce to you now that there is, in fact, another Jubilee to follow, according to God's ordinance. It is the promised Jubilee of all Jubilees, the ultimate Jubilee. But before we can continue to uncover what that future holds, we have to take a step back to uncover a major step of this entire puzzle. It is another ancient mystery apart from the Jubilees that's been hidden, and the fate of the entire world hangs upon it. This ancient mystery is behind everything from 9/11 to our economy, to the housing boom, to the war in Iraq, the collapse of Wall Street, everything in precise detail. It holds the key to our future, the rise and fall of nations, to world history. And it's not only a mystery, it's a warning, an alarm, and it is all centered around America. But what does America have to do with Israel, you may ask? Israel was unique among the nations, as it was conceived and dedicated at its foundation for the purposes of God. The United States is a civilization also conceived and dedicated to the will of God from its conception from modern times. Those who laid America's foundations saw it as a new Israel, an Israel of the New World. As with ancient Israel, they saw it as in a covenant with God, meaning its rise or fall would be dependent on its relationship with God. Like Israel, if it followed His ways, America would become the most blessed, prosperous, and powerful nation on earth. From the very beginning, they foretold it, and what they foretold would come true. America would rise to heights no other nation had ever known. It would be a vessel of redemption, an instrument of God's purposes, and a light to the world. It would give refuge to the world's poor and needy, and hope to the oppressed. It would stand against tyranny. It would fight against the dark forces and movements in the modern world that threatened to engulf the earth. But just as Israel had turned away from God and His ways, America's blessings would be removed, and the hedge of protection over the nation would also be removed. America has done much good, and none had been so blessed, but to whom much is given, much is required. When Israel turned, it started with a spiritual complacency, then spiritual confusion, then the merging of God with idols, then, ultimately, the rejection of his ways. Like Israel, America followed the same footsteps. By the 1950s, America began officially removing God from its national life. It abolished prayer and scripture in its public schools. As Israel removed the Ten Commandments from its national consciousness, America did likewise, banning it from the public square. By government decree, from its walls, God was progressively driven out of its life. The very mention of God or Jesus became more and more taboo and unwelcome unless for mockery or attack. Idols would slowly come in to replace him. They wouldn't be the same idols like Baal or Molech, but idols of sensuality, idols of greed, of money, success, comfort, materialism, pleasure, sexual immorality, self-worship, self-obsession. The sacred disappeared, and the profane took its place. Soon, the nation forgot its foundations, its purpose, and its calling. As the nation stopped tolerating godliness, it began to tolerate immorality and purity. Today, it demands that we all tolerate impurity and accept it as part of natural. We are told that homosexuality and trans is normal, and we dare to say otherwise. The nation legalized the killing of its unborn. The blood of the innocent now stained its collective hands, just as Israel had sacrificed countless babies on the altars of Baal and Molech. America is now on the brink of judgment. God has been continuously calling America to come back to him, but it has not been listening. So the nation entered a new stage. That stage would see the removal of the nation's hedge of protection. Israel went through the same stage, and God sent warnings through the prophets. Prophets like Elijah, Elisha, Hosea, and Amos. They pleaded with the nation, warning them and calling them to return. But the nation rejected the call and declared war on those who remained faithful. They branded the prophets as troublemakers, irritants, dangerous, and, finally, enemies of the state. They would be marginalized, vilified, persecuted, and even hunted down. The nation grew deaf to the call, so the alarm grew louder, and the warnings more severe. Warnings more severe. This is where America is currently. God's church has been the voice of God warning the nation to turn back to him, but it has ultimately been ignored. Few realized the critical line they had crossed and the new and dangerous era they had entered. No political or military power under the stars and stripes would be strong enough to ensure their safety, only a return to God. God removed that hedge of protection. It wasn't long that there would be a breach in its walls. The illusion of invincibility would be shattered, and its defenses would fail. The nation that had so long known the blessings of peace and security witnessed its walls of protection broken through as its defenses failed. On September 11, 2001, the walls of America's national security were breached. The most powerful nation on earth, with the most sophisticated defense system ever built by man, failed. The same happened to Israel in 732 BC. When the Assyrians attacked ancient Israel, it breached the walls of Jerusalem. So too would it happen in America, not planned by God, but by evil men. they succeeded because the protection was lifted. The alarm was sounding on the nation to change its course, to save it from judgment. And before we continue, we need to know who these Assyrians were and why they attacked Israel. This brutal civilization came from northern Mesopotamia. They had been around for quite some time, but by the 1st century BC, they began to rise to world power. They began their conquest of the surrounding lands. They marched into Babylon, Syria, Lebanon, Persia, and Egypt, until, at the peak of their power, most of the ancient Middle East was under their rule. They had the largest army to ever come from Mesopotamia up to that time. The empire was a war machine, the most brutal people to walk the face of the earth. They instilled terror and dread to anyone by the mention of their name. They made terror into a science. They perfected and mastered it. It was the Assyrians who caused the breach. They terrified the people of Israel to their core. Therefore, the ancient sign of the Assyrians would be the terrorists. Terrorism is defined as the systematic application of terror, violence, and intimidation to achieve a specific end. Terror as an applied science. This was the dark gift that the Assyrians gave to the world. And this is the link in the mystery joining America to ancient Israel. The ancient Assyrians are the spiritual fathers of the modern-day terrorists in Al-Qaeda, the very people who orchestrated the attacks on 9/11. Not only are they spiritual fathers, the Assyrians were a Semitic people, as are the Arab terrorists. The Assyrians spoke Akkadian. It is now extinct, but there is still spoken in the modern world a language considered to be the closest of all tongues to ancient Akkadian: Arabic, the tongue of Al-Qaeda. Just as the Assyrians orchestrated the attack on Israel in 732 BC, so too did the terrorists orchestrate the attack on 9/11. In retaliation, America went to war against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to hunt them down. This connection to 9/11 was clear, but what wasn't clear was the connection to the second phase of the war, Iraq. In April 2003, American soldiers would enter the Iraqi city of Mosul, which became one of their major operational bases in the Iraq War. Inside the city, near the junction of the Tigris and Kosor rivers, there rest two mounds of earth. One is called Huyunjik, the other Nabis Yunus. Hidden inside these mounds are the ruins of a once great civilization. The ruins are all that's left of the ancient city called Nineveh. And Nineveh was the capital and the final resting place and graveyard of the Assyrian Empire. American troops, or the New Israel, were now walking the same ground where the enemies of ancient Israel walked. And among those watching them pass by were those who still claimed to be the flesh and blood descendants of the ancient Assyrians. So America was drawn into a war with the land of Iraq, ancient Assyria, just as ancient Israel was drawn into war with ancient Assyria, the land of Iraq. But Israel would ultimately discover that the danger it faced could not be solved by the power of its weapons or the thickness of its walls. The real danger was not outside of its gates, but within them. When the nation turned from God, it lost its protective covering. Apart from a return to God, there would be no safety. By the time they finally realized it, it would be too late. The chance was lost. There is a prophetic word in Scripture that speaks directly to this Assyrian invasion. Isaiah 9:10. The bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with hewn stones. The sycamore are cut down, but we will replace them with cedars. Like what we have seen from the final words of Moses in Deuteronomy and the law of Jubilees in Leviticus concerning Israel's return to their possession, so too will Isaiah 9:10 play a significant role in everything we are about to lay out for you concerning America and its warning of judgment upon it. What do bricks and sycamore trees have to do with America? Everything. To understand how, we need to understand what it meant for ancient Israel. The prophetic words of this scripture reveal the very course of the nation would take after the invasion. After the walls were destroyed with bricks fallen, what did they do in light of the calamity? Rather than re-examine their ways and take heed to God's warning to turn back to Him, they reject the call to return. Instead, they focus on rebuilding the walls. They missed the warning. Out of their own pride, they silenced the alarm and chose to become stronger than ever and rise to greater heights under their own efforts. With God's warning ignored, they vowed to pick up the pieces and pick up where they were in ignorance. The vow was a sign of their hardening hearts and a rejection of God's calling. The vow itself is a sign of judgment. And as a sign, we can identify that it also plays a direct part in what happened in America. After the attack was over, the people of Israel began surveying the damage. They found ruins of collapsed buildings, heaps of rubble, and fallen bricks. The bricks were substandard material and vulnerable to destruction. They saw that it was evidence for their vulnerability, and they were in danger of further attacks and another easy defeat. It was also a sign that God was trying to reveal to them. But rather than turn back to God, they chose a different path. And the fallen bricks for America, it was right there, at ground zero. As the dust of September 11th settled on New York City, people emerged to survey the damage. The World Trade Center had collapsed into a colossal heap of ruins. As we all watched on TV, the ruins at Ground Zero became the most visible and identifiable sign of what had happened. The image would be seared into the nation's collective consciousness, the sign of destruction. Like Israel, America realized it was vulnerable. Its very security was resting on shaky ground. It was a warning to even the most proud, towering nations. The bricks fell down to the earth in just a matter of seconds. For a time, the nation was on its knees, calling on God once again for healing, for answers, for mercy. But it wasn't a genuine cry for God. Within weeks, the nation would take the same vow of defiance that Israel had in response to their invasion, and they were looking inwards instead with pride and determination to be rebuilt, rather than be redeemed. Up next, we uncover the next part of the Isaiah 9:10 mystery, and what happened after 9/11 would prove even more ominous. Here on Prophecies Uncovered.